Jake rode along the fence line of his ranch, the morning sun just beginning to rise and paint the sky in soft hues of orange and pink. His horse, Copper, moved steadily beneath him, the rhythmic sound of hooves the only noise breaking the early morning silence. The wide, empty stretches of land around him were peaceful, but as he turned a corner, his eyes caught something that didn't belong. Up ahead, on the side of the road, a wagon stood still, one of its wheels broken and lodged awkwardly in the dirt. As Jake rode closer, he could see the woman struggling beside it. Her clothes were dusty, her face drawn with exhaustion. A small boy, maybe 7 years old, was beside her, trying in vain to lift the wheel. The woman's face tightened as she noticed Jake's approach, a flicker of fear crossing her eyes. The boy, however, saw Jake first. "Mama, someone's coming," he said, his voice laced with both hope and anxiety. The woman stiffened, her body tensing as she looked up. Jake could see the wariness in her eyes. He pulled Copper to a stop, tipping his hat slightly. "Ma'am, looks like you could use some help," he said, his voice low and calm. She hesitated, glancing at the boy before looking back at Jake. "We're fine," she said, her tone defensive. "Just the wheel came loose." Jake didn't buy it. He could see that the wheel was stuck in a way that couldn't be fixed without proper tools. That wheel's not going anywhere without a good repair. "You're a good ways from town, too. Where you headed?" The woman's gaze flickered. "West," she said, her voice vague. "Just west." The boy, his curiosity bubbling over, spoke up. "We're trying to get far away, Mama says." She shushed him quickly, her eyes darting nervously toward Jake. He could tell there was more to the story than they were letting on. He studied their wagon, noting the few belongings they had packed and the signs of wear on both the wagon and their clothes. These weren't just travelers. It looked like they were running from something. Jake glanced at the woman, then at the boy whose stomach growled loudly, the sound echoing in the stillness. "You won't make it far like this. The nearest town is 2 days' ride, and that wagon's not going anywhere without a fix." The woman bit her lip, weighing her options. Jake could see the desperation in her eyes, the kind of weariness that came from too many days of uncertainty. "I'm not asking for charity," she said, her voice tight. Jake nodded. "I'm not offering charity, ma'am. My ranch is about an hour from here. I can get that wheel fixed, feed you, and give you a place to rest. You'll be back on your way after that." For a moment, the woman seemed to consider his offer, her eyes scanning his face for any sign of trickery. Jake held her gaze, steady and calm. She knew she had little choice. Finally, with a sigh, she nodded. "Thank you." Jake dismounted from his horse and walked over to the wagon. "No need to thank me yet. Let's get that wheel off and on my way." The woman, still wary, watched as he worked to untie the broken wheel. The boy lingered beside her, his wide eyes curious as he watched Jake with a mix of awe and caution. "That's a nice horse, mister," the boy said, his voice hesitant but full of wonder. "What's his name?" Jake smiled, his voice softening as he responded. "Copper. He's old, but he's loyal." The boy's face lit up, clearly pleased with the answer. "He's real pretty." Jake chuckled and set to work on the wheel. "He's a good one. Can't say that about too many things in this world." As he worked, the boy watched closely, asking questions here and there, his curiosity too strong to contain. The woman, however, stayed back, her arms crossed over her chest, clearly protective of her son. Despite her wariness, Jake didn't push her to talk. He just worked quietly, getting the job done. When the wheel was finally fixed, Jake stood up and wiped his hands on his trousers. "All right, it'll hold for now. Let's get this wagon back to the ranch. I can't promise it'll be a palace, but it's a safe place to rest for a while." The woman hesitated, clearly torn, but the boy's stomach growled loudly again, and she glanced at him with a mixture of guilt and exhaustion. Without saying another word, she nodded. "Come on, Mama," the boy said, tugging at her sleeve. "Let's go with him. I think he's nice." Jake smiled at the boy, who gave him a shy but hopeful look. The woman followed behind, keeping her distance, but also knowing there was no real choice. Together, they made their way toward Jake's ranch. The landscape stretched out before them, wild and open. The ranch was simple but well kept, with a small house, a barn, and pastures that were dotted with chickens and grazing cattle. As they neared the gate, the boy's eyes grew wide with wonder. "You live here all alone?" he asked, his voice full of disbelief. Jake gave a small, bittersweet smile. "I do now. Used to have family." The boy's face fell slightly, but he didn't ask more. The woman, however, caught the sadness in his voice and looked away quickly, as if avoiding the question. The trio made their way into the barn, and Jake began to work on the wagon. The woman and boy settled near a pile of hay, watching him in silence. There was something unspoken between them, a shared understanding of hardship, but neither of them said a word. As the day wore on, they all worked together. Jake fixed the fence, while the woman and boy helped in their own small ways. Despite the tension that lingered in the air, there was an ease in the way they worked side by side, an unspoken connection that, for just a moment, made them seem like a family. It wasn't much, but for the first time in a long while, Jake felt something he hadn't felt in years: hope. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the ranch, the distant silhouette of a rider appeared on the horizon. Jake, already on edge from the earlier tension, motioned for Sarah and Michael to hurry into the barn, his voice low and urgent. "Get inside, both of you. Now." The fear that washed over Sarah's face was unmistakable as she grabbed Michael's hand, her eyes darting between Jake and the approaching rider. She didn't need to be told twice. As they ducked into the barn, Jake remained outside, watching the rider carefully. The figure grew closer, and for a moment, Jake's hand instinctively went to the rifle slung across his back. But as the rider drew near, Jake recognized him. It was old Pete, the neighboring rancher, riding in for a quick visit. With a wave and a brief nod of recognition, Pete passed by without a second thought, and Jake relaxed, breathing a quiet sigh of relief. He waited a moment longer, ensuring Pete was out of sight, before heading to the barn. "It's just a neighbor," Jake called, stepping into the dim light of the barn. "You're safe." But Sarah, her face pale and trembling, didn't immediately respond. Michael clung to her side, his small body trembling too. Finally, Sarah spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "Jake, who are we really running from?" Jake's gaze softened, sensing the weight of her words. She hesitated, and for a moment, he thought she wouldn't answer. But then, with a deep breath, she finally spoke the truth. "My husband, ex-husband. His name is David." She paused, her fingers trembling as she wiped her brow, her voice thick with unshed tears. "He wasn't always like this, but after we married, he changed, became violent. He controlled everything, and when I disagreed, when I tried to stand up for myself, he hurt me." Sarah's eyes filled with fear as she looked down at Michael, who was already clinging to her side. "I took Michael and left 3 days ago, while he was away. I couldn't stay another minute, knowing what he was capable of." Jake stood still, processing her words, his jaw tight. "He's looking for you, isn't he?" he asked, already knowing the answer. Sarah nodded, her eyes full of sorrow. "He won't stop. He said I belong to him, that I'm his, and I always will be." Jake's gut tightened at her words, a deep sense of anger rising within him. He didn't say anything for a long while, his mind turning over her confession. Finally, he spoke, his voice quiet but firm. "You're not his. Not anymore. And he won't get you, Sarah. Not while I'm here." She looked up at him, gratitude flickering in her eyes. But there was also a fear that wouldn't be easily shaken. "But we can't stay here, Jake. Not if he's looking for us. He'll find us, and he'll hurt you too." The words hung heavy in the air between them. Jake hesitated for a moment, then spoke with a calm resolve. "Stay the night, at least until morning. It's too dark to travel, and you need rest. If you want to leave first thing, you can. But tonight, You're safe here." Sarah opened her mouth to protest, but closed it again, exhausted. "Just tonight," she said quietly, her voice laced with the weight of everything she had been carrying. She and Michael had barely sat down when Jake set to work making them a simple meal. The barn was quiet except for the sound of soft chatter and the occasional clink of metal as Jake worked in the kitchen. Despite the tension, the warmth of the fire, the simple comfort of the meal, and the quiet presence of each other began to soften the edges of Sarah's fear. Michael, having eaten, moved close to Jake, looking up at him with curiosity. "Jake, you're nice. You don't act like other people." His words were innocent, but they hit Sarah like a punch in the gut. She didn't want to let herself believe it, didn't want to trust too easily. But in that moment, she couldn't help but feel something shift in her heart. She had been running for so long, never stopping to look back, but something in Jake's kindness, his quiet strength, made her want to stop. She could feel the crack in her armor, but fear still held her tightly. After Michael fell asleep, Sarah joined Jake on the porch, the cool evening air brushing across her skin as she sat down beside him. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice almost a whisper, "for not asking too many questions." Jake turned his gaze to her, his eyes calm and understanding. "Everyone has their story. Some harder than others," he said. "Why are you helping us?" Sarah's voice cracked with emotion as she asked the question, something raw and vulnerable in her eyes. Jake paused before answering, the weight of his own past flickering across his face. "I lost my wife and daughter 8 years ago. My house has been empty since. Seeing you with Michael reminded me what matters." There was a silence between them as Sarah processed his words. She saw the pain in his eyes, but also a kindness, a softness. Something deep inside her stirred, but she wasn't ready to trust it fully. Yet for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to feel something other than fear. Something like hope. As the night deepened, Sarah stood, giving him a small, tight smile. "Thank you," she repeated, "for everything." Jake nodded, but didn't say anything else. They didn't need words. He understood. They both did. The morning light filtered through the barn's small window, casting a soft glow over the sleeping figures of Sarah and Michael. Jake had already been up for hours, tending to the horses and taking care of the chores that never seemed to end. As he worked, he couldn't shake the weight of the conversation they'd had the night before. The promise he made to Sarah lingered in his mind. He would protect her and her boy from whatever danger followed them. He knew that David wouldn't give up easily, but Jake wasn't going to let him harm them. He would fight to keep them safe. By the time Sarah and Michael woke, the sun was high in the sky, and Jake was preparing a simple breakfast, bacon and eggs with a side of freshly baked bread. Michael was the first to come out of the barn, his eyes blinking in the early morning light as he stretched and yawned. He was followed by Sarah, who, though clearly tired, seemed more at ease than she had the day before. The unease in her eyes hadn't disappeared entirely, but there was a shift, a flicker of something else, a glimmer of trust, of relief, perhaps. They ate together, the three of them in the quiet kitchen, with Jake speaking little but offering the occasional smile or encouraging word to Michael. Sarah didn't speak much either, her mind clearly preoccupied with the uncertainty of their situation. But she was present, more so than she had been in weeks. It was as if the weight of their journey, of all the fear and exhaustion, had finally eased just a little. After breakfast, they made their way outside. Michael immediately ran to the fence, his small hands eagerly helping Jake with the posts. Sarah stayed close by, watching them work together with a growing sense of wonder. Michael's bright eyes followed Jake's every movement as he showed the boy how to hold the posts steady while he hammered them into place. There is something deeply comforting about watching them, about seeing her son so eager to learn from Jake. It was a stark contrast to the fearful child she had known for so long. Slowly, she joined in, helping to dig the holes and measure the distances for the posts. The work was hard, but there was something about it, something honest and grounding, that made her feel a little less afraid. She didn't need to talk about her past to feel the weight of it lift. Just being here with Jake, with Michael, was enough. As the afternoon passed, they managed to get a good section of the fence completed, and it was clear that the bond between them, though fragile, was growing stronger with every nail hammered, every post set into the earth. Michael was beaming with pride when he successfully hammered in a nail for the first time, looking up at Jake with wide, shining eyes. "I did it! Look, I did it!" he exclaimed, his voice filled with pure joy. Jake smiled, ruffling his hair. "You sure did, son. You've got a natural talent for this," he said, the word son slipping out before he could stop it. It felt right, and it felt like a promise, like an unspoken bond forming between them. The day was drawing to a close when the sound of hooves echoed in the distance, and Sarah's face went pale. She stood quickly, her hand flying to Michael as she looked toward the horizon, her entire body rigid with fear. "We need to leave. Now," she said, her voice tight, filled with panic. Jake's brow furrowed as he tried to calm her. "The wagon's not ready yet," he said, stepping toward her. "It'll be dark soon. You can't travel at night." But Sarah wasn't listening. Her eyes were wide with terror, and she was already pulling Michael toward the barn. "I don't care. We have to go. Please, Jake, we have to leave now." Her words were frantic, and it hit Jake hard, the desperation in her voice telling him just how deep the fear ran. He turned and looked toward the horizon where the rider was still approaching. His instincts told him it wasn't David. It didn't feel like him, but he couldn't be sure. He had to make Sarah feel safe, but he also had to make sure they weren't running from shadows. The rider came closer, and Jake stood tall, his voice steady. "Get in the barn, both of you," he said. Sarah didn't argue. She just grabbed Michael's hand and disappeared into the shadows of the barn. Jake stayed outside, watching the rider, ready for whatever might come. As the figure drew closer, Jake realized it was just old Pete, riding through for a quick check. The tension in Jake's body slowly released as Pete waved from a distance, not even slowing his pace. The rider passed, and Jake let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. He turned and walked toward the barn, his steps heavy. "It's safe," he called quietly. "Just a neighbor." Inside the barn, Sarah and Michael were huddled together, Sarah still trembling. Michael was clinging to her, his eyes wide and full of fear. Jake closed the door behind him and looked at Sarah, his voice soft but firm. "Who are you running from?" The question hung in the air between them, and for a long time, there was only silence. Then, Sarah finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "David, my ex-husband. He's violent, and he's been looking for us." Jake's jaw tightened as he absorbed her words. He didn't need to ask any more questions. He could see the fear in her eyes, the fear of a woman who had been trapped for too long. "You're safe here," he said quietly, though he wasn't sure how much longer that would hold true. "As long as you need." Sarah looked at him, gratitude mixed with something else, something she couldn't quite name. "Thank you," she said softly, but Jake knew she wasn't just thanking him for his help with the wagon. She was thanking him for offering her a sliver of safety, of hope, in a world that had been nothing but fear for far too long. The weight of her words settled between them, and Jake knew this was just the beginning. Things were changing now, and he wasn't going to let them slip away. Not if he could help it. Not if he had any say in the matter. The next few days were tense, as if the very earth beneath their feet was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Jake kept a careful watch, though he did his best not to let Sarah and Michael see just how on edge he was. The air was thick with anticipation, each creak of the barn door or distant sound of hooves making Sarah jump. Michael, too, was unusually quiet, his bright eyes always scanning the horizon. Jake worked tirelessly on the ranch, trying to keep his mind occupied, but every time he saw Sarah's face, every time she glanced nervously at the sky or asked about the road, he couldn't help but wonder when the storm would hit. Then one morning, as Jake was checking the fence line, he saw it, a rider in the distance, moving quickly, dust rising behind him. His gut told him it wasn't just another passerby. He could feel it, the cold knot of dread that had been tightening in his chest ever since Sarah had arrived. "Riders coming," Jake said quietly, turning to Sarah, who was already standing in the doorway of the barn, her eyes wide with fear. Without a word, she grabbed Michael's hand and pulled him close, her face pale. Jake could see her heart racing as she held her son tighter, her whole body tense with terror. "Get to the cellar," Jake ordered, his voice firm. Sarah hesitated for only a moment, then nodded, taking Michael's hand and heading inside. Jake stood still for a moment, watching the rider approach, his breath steady but his heart pounding in his chest. When the rider was close enough, Jake recognized him immediately as Sheriff Martinez, a man he had known for years, though they weren't particularly close. The sheriff pulled up to the gate, dismounting quickly and walking toward Jake. "Jake, got word you might be expecting company," Sheriff Martinez said, his voice carrying a hint of concern. Jake didn't reply immediately, just nodded and studied the sheriff's face. "What kind of word?" he asked, his tone low and cautious. The sheriff's expression darkened as he glanced toward the barn where Sarah and Michael had just disappeared. "Word is a man named David Chen's been asking around the settlements. Says his wife ran off with his son," the sheriff said, his voice thick with the weight of the information. "He's been looking for them." Sarah's breath hitched inside the barn, but Jake could hear the sheriff's words clearly. "David." Sarah's voice trembled from inside, but she didn't come out. Jake turned toward the barn, his eyes narrowing. He knew the sheriff wasn't done, so he turned back to him and took a step closer. "What's he capable of, Sheriff?" "What do you know?" he asked. Sheriff Martinez's face tightened with grim understanding. "David's a dangerous man, Jake. Violent, possessive. He won't stop until he finds them. He's been asking questions, and I'm certain he's close." The sheriff paused, watching Jake carefully. "I won't lie to you, Jake. He's 3 days behind them, and he'll be here eventually. You need to be prepared." Jake's blood ran cold at the sheriff's words, but he didn't let it show. He nodded, keeping his voice steady. "We'll be ready," he said, the words coming out more firmly than he had expected. Sheriff Martinez studied him for a moment, then sighed. "Law's complicated with domestic situations, especially ones like this. Unless he commits a crime on your land, there's not much I can do." Jake's eyes hardened. "So we're on our own, then?" The sheriff hesitated before responding. "You are, but if you need help, you know where to find me." With a final glance at the barn, the sheriff mounted his horse and rode off, leaving Jake standing alone, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. Inside the barn, Sarah had finally emerged, her face pale but determined. She looked at Jake, fear flickering in her eyes, but also something else, something that made her appear smaller, more vulnerable than ever before. "He's close," she said, her voice shaking. "He won't stop. He won't ever stop looking for us." Jake didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stepped toward her, taking a long, steadying breath. "You're not alone anymore," he said, his voice strong, reassuring. "I'm not going to let him hurt you. I promise you that." Sarah's eyes searched his face, trying to find the truth in his words. After a long moment, she finally nodded. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice quiet. Jake's jaw tightened. "Now we get ready." He turned, walking toward the house, but his eyes scanned the horizon again, the dark cloud of uncertainty settling heavily over the ranch. He knew David was coming, and soon they would have to face him. But he wouldn't let fear take hold of them, not while he was still breathing. He would protect them, no matter the cost. That was a promise he intended to keep. The days that followed Sheriff Martinez's visit were a blur of tension and preparation. Jake didn't sleep much, his mind always alert, his body tense with the constant fear that David Sean was already too close. Every sound made him jump. Hooves in the distance, the rustle of leaves in the wind. He kept the rifle close, checking it often, his fingers brushing over the cold steel as if the simple act of holding it could keep the fear at bay. Sarah, too, was on edge, her eyes constantly scanning the horizon, though she tried her best to appear calm for Michael's sake. The boy, ever curious, kept asking questions about what was happening, why they couldn't go into town, or why they had to stay inside so much. Jake answered him as best he could, but the unease in the air was palpable, and Michael's bright eyes slowly began to lose their spark, replaced by the quiet fear he didn't quite understand. The silence of the ranch was broken only by the sound of hooves and the occasional gust of wind. For 2 days, the tension built, every day feeling like it could be the one that brought David. Jake kept his promise. He didn't let Sarah or Michael out of his sight. He taught Sarah what he could about self-defense, showing her how to handle a rifle, how to stand firm and hold her ground if it came to that. The work on the ranch continued, but it was harder now. Every chore was done with one eye on the distance, waiting for the threat to arrive. Jake's focus was on getting them ready, physically and mentally, for the fight that seemed inevitable. Michael followed him everywhere, his small hands trying to help with whatever task Jake was doing, eager to prove himself, to show that he could be brave too. "Is he really coming, Pa?" Michael asked one evening, his voice small and uncertain. Jake didn't want to lie, didn't want to fill his son's heart with unnecessary fear. But he couldn't offer false comfort either. "Probably," Jake said, his voice steady but not without the gravity of the situation. "But we'll be ready." It wasn't until the second night that the question Sarah had been dreading slipped from her lips. She found Jake on the porch, keeping watch as always. The night was still, the air cool against her skin. "Jake," she said quietly, her voice filled with something fragile, if he doesn't come for us, could we stay? Could we really make this our home? Could we stay here?" Jake's heart clenched at her words, at the quiet hope that filled her voice. It wasn't just a question about a place. It was a question about their future, about what they could become. The answer was simple, even though it wasn't the easy one. "If we survive this, if David doesn't come, we'll make this our home," Jake said, his voice firm. "Not just for tonight, not just for a few days. For as long as you want." Sarah's eyes softened, filled with a mix of hope and fear. And for the first time since they had met, Jake saw her let go of the walls she'd built around her heart, just a little. The next morning, the air felt thicker, as if something was building, something inevitable. The day passed slowly, each hour dragging as Jake tried to focus on the work at hand. But he couldn't shake the feeling that David was closer than ever. The sun began to set, and Jake stood outside, his eyes scanning the horizon once more. That was when he saw it, a dust cloud rising in the distance, a figure on horseback coming fast. His heart dropped into his stomach. This was it. He turned quickly and called out to Sarah, his voice urgent. "Take Michael to the root cellar." Now, he didn't wait for a response, just watched as Sarah rushed to grab her son, her face filled with the same terror that had been consuming her for days. He didn't want her to go, didn't want her to be hiding while he faced this alone, but he knew that she needed to protect Michael. He had to face David, and he would, alone if necessary. As the rider grew closer, Jake stood his ground, rifle in hand, his body tense and ready. David had found them, and now there would be no more running. Jake wasn't just defending a ranch, he was defending a family, his family, and he would do whatever it took to protect them. The rider finally came into view, tall and imposing, a cold smirk on his face as he took in the sight of Jake standing firm on the land that was now his. David dismounted slowly, his eyes scanning Jake with a mixture of disdain and fury. "Well," David drawled, his voice dripping with malice, "I finally found you." Jake didn't flinch. "This is private property," he said coldly. "Turn around." David chuckled darkly, his eyes narrowing. "That's my wife and my son in there, old man. And I'm taking them home." "She's not your wife. He's not your son," Jake shot back. "And this is their home." David's expression darkened. "You really want to die for them, old man?" he sneered. Jake's hand tightened around the rifle. "I'm not dying today. Not while I have something worth protecting." David took a step forward, his hand twitching near his own gun. You're choosing to die then. Jake's voice was steady, unwavering. I'm choosing to protect my family. David grinned, a vicious gleam in his eyes. Your family? You think of their family. The air between them crackled with tension, the standoff a moment that seemed to stretch for eternity. Neither man moved, neither man spoke, as the weight of the confrontation settled like a storm cloud over the land. Jake wasn't going to back down. He was ready for this fight, and if it came to it, he would see it through. Sarah and Michael were depending on him. This was their moment, their stand. And Jake wasn't about to let them lose it. The sun rose on the day after the standoff, and with it, the quiet but undeniable shift in the air. Sarah, Jake, and Michael had survived the night, and the fear that had gripped them for so long began to feel like a distant memory. It wasn't gone, not entirely, but it had lost some of its power. The danger wasn't over, but there was a new sense of strength between them, something that hadn't been there before. Michael, who had spent so many days full of worry, was different now. There was a light in his eyes again, a joy that hadn't been present for far too long. He was no longer the frightened little boy who clung to his mother for dear life. And Sarah noticed it too, the way he was starting to walk taller, hold his head higher. She was beginning to trust Jake more than she ever thought possible, not just because of his strength in the face of danger, but because of his quiet, steady presence in their lives. He had given them more than just protection. He had given them a sense of belonging, of being seen. The days stretched into a new rhythm. Sarah and Michael worked alongside Jake, learning what they could, adjusting to the life he had built here. They worked the land together, shared meals, and spent evenings sitting on the porch, watching the sun set behind the hills. It felt like a family, and Sarah couldn't help but feel like she had found something she had thought was lost forever. Jake had given them more than just safety. He had given them a home. And with each passing day, Sarah realized that what had once been a fleeting hope was now a growing certainty. She was falling in love with him, not just with the man who had saved them, but with the quiet kindness he showed, with the way he treated Michael like his own son, with the way he made her believe in the possibility of a future again. It wasn't perfect. There were still fears, still shadows lingering. But the future they were building together felt real, solid, and for the first time in years, Sarah felt like she could breathe. One evening, as the stars began to twinkle in the darkening sky, Michael asked Jake the question that had been on his mind for days. "Pa," he said, his voice tentative, "when you adopt me, does that mean I'm your real son? Like forever?" Jake stopped working, his hands resting on the fence post he had just finished. He looked down at Michael, his heart swelling with pride at the boy's bravery in asking. "Michael," Jake said, his voice thick with emotion, "you've always been my son. The paper just makes it official." Michael's face lit up with a smile that was pure joy, and Sarah's heart melted as she watched them together. It felt right, in a way she couldn't quite explain. Jake wasn't just helping them. He was becoming part of them, becoming their family. And it was clear that Michael knew that too. Later, as they sat around the table for dinner, Sarah looked at Jake with new eyes, seeing him not just as the man who had helped them survive, but as the man she wanted to build a future with. "Jake," she said quietly, her voice unsure, "can we make this real? Can we stay here forever?" Jake looked up from his plate, his eyes softening as he met her gaze. "Sarah, I've already made my choice. You and Michael, you're my family now. Forever." The words settled between them, simple but powerful, and in that moment, Sarah knew that they had built something stronger than they had ever imagined. A life together, rooted in love, and one that would survive whatever the future brought. The idea of forever no longer felt like a distant dream. It felt like something they could touch, something they had already begun to create. And when Michael asked, "Pa, when are you going to marry Mama?" Jake and Sarah exchanged a look, and for the first time, it felt like the right time to answer the question that had been hanging in the air between them. "Soon, buddy," Jake said, his voice gentle but firm. "We're going to make it official. We're going to be a family, and we're going to make it real. As Sarah watched them, her heart filled with hope. She had feared this moment would never come. But now, standing there with Jake and Michael, she knew it was only the beginning of a new chapter. A chapter they would write together as a family. The day of the wedding arrived with a clear sky and a gentle breeze, the world feeling wide open and full of promise. Sarah stood in front of the small mirror in their makeshift bedroom, adjusting the simple dress she had made herself, the fabric rough but comforting in her hands. She had never imagined she would wear anything like this again, but here she was on the brink of a new beginning. Michael, dressed in his best clothes, ran around the house excitedly, unable to keep still. He kept asking, "Is it time yet? Are we going to get married now?" And his wide, joyful grin never faded. Sarah smiled at his enthusiasm, her heart swelling with love for both him and Jake. She had never expected to find this kind of happiness again, not after all the fear, all the running. But now, here she was with a man who loved her, with a son who had finally found his place in the world, and a future that no longer seemed so uncertain. Jake, too, was ready, nervous but full of joy, his hands fidgeting with the cufflinks as he looked at his reflection in the barn's window. He had never imagined that he'd find love again, let alone build a family with a woman and a child who needed him as much as he needed them. The ranch, once a lonely, silent place, was now filled with laughter, warmth, and life. The ceremony was simple, held outside under a wide oak tree with neighbors and friends gathered to celebrate them. Old Pete, who had become a friend to them all, stood at the front, officiating with a warm smile, his words heartfelt and sincere. "Who gives this woman to this man?" he asked, looking at Michael, who without hesitation piped up, "She gives herself, but I approve." The laughter that followed was pure joy, and Sarah couldn't help but laugh too, her heart light with the love surrounding her. The vows they exchanged were simple but full of meaning. Jake promised to protect Sarah and Michael, to be the father and husband they deserved, to build a life together on this land that had become their home. Sarah promised to trust him with her heart, to build their future with love and commitment, and to cherish every day they had together. And together, they promised Michael that he was theirs forever and always. The kiss that followed was gentle, filled with the quiet understanding of everything they had overcome to get to this point. As they pulled apart, Michael cheered, running toward them with his arms wide, and the world felt perfect, just as it was. Afterward, the sheriff, who had brought the legal papers with him, officiated the adoption, officially making Michael Jake's son. "Michael Morrison," the sheriff read, his voice proud. "Legally adopted son of Jake Morrison." Michael's face lit up as he ran to Jake, his arms wrapping around him in a tight hug. "I'm Michael Morrison now, Really?" Jake's eyes were full of emotion as he hugged the boy back, feeling the weight of the promise he had made. This was his son in every way that mattered. As the day wound down, the celebration continued with a simple feast, music, and dancing. The ranch, once a quiet, lonely place, was now alive with the sounds of a family that had found each other and neighbors who had become friends. Later, as the stars twinkled above and the last of the guests departed, Jake and Sarah stood together on the porch, holding hands, the night air cool against their skin. "We made it," Sarah whispered, looking at him with a soft smile. "We really made it." Jake squeezed her hand, his eyes full of love. "This is just the beginning, Sarah. We're in this together. Forever." With Michael asleep between them, the two of them stood on that porch, looking out at the peaceful land that had brought them together. The future stretched out before them, full of possibility, and for the first time in a long while, Sarah felt the full weight of peace settle in her heart. They had built something beautiful here, something real, a family, and they would face whatever came next together.